to grow vat-grown salmon, you have to grow all these types of cells and then mix them together in a way that seems meat-like and not like a slurry. And that's a formidable technical challenge. The second thing is why it might seem dystopian, is when that's going to happen, the only way it seems likely to happen is if you can have economies of scale, which is true of the rest of the food industry. So it's not really a surprise. So you're going to have, not, mom and pop, Farmer John growing the vat-grown salmon. It's going to be Monsanto or Archer Daniels Midland or some huge biotech company growing them in gigantic industrial facilities. The vats will be not bathtubs, but the size of airplane hangars. The person who's going to do it is not going to be, as I said, Farmer John, but it's going to be Elon Musk.
This show is about the systems that make the modern world possible. We've made the whole planet into one giant machine, full of the strangest stories. And now the systems that make life possible are coming apart. It's different from a regular interview show because while I'm talking to my guests, I'll also be adding things to an ever-expanding map of all the people, places, ideas, technologies, and events that have made the modern world what it is. In just a few short months, we will have a comprehensive diagram of everything that has ever mattered. It's time to do your own research. The first episode, the one you're watching now, focuses on the food system, the fundamental thing that makes everything else possible. We now produce more calories than we need to sustain life on Earth, and people still go hungry. How do we make this giant system of mega farms and mega famines, and whose interests does it really serve? My guest this week is Charles C. Mann, the New York Times bestselling author of The Wizard and the Prophet, and the new series How the System Works, about all those things, public health, electricity, water, and food, that are so important we barely realise they exist. Charles Mann, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Oh, my pleasure to be here, virtually.
So our topic here is the mega machine, the vast complex of systems, from the electrical grid to public health, to the food distribution system, to the clean water supply that we all take for granted now. These kind of vast systems. And hopefully I think this conversation will go in lots of different directions across all those different systems, focusing mostly on food and on public health, but also on some other things. But I want to begin really concrete, and it's with an experience that I have had, and I think probably lots of our viewers have also had, which is that I go to the supermarket, right? And I experience an abundance in the supermarket that is beyond not just my wildest dreams, right? I don't even know what all things in the supermarket are, but also beyond the wildest dreams of almost anyone who has ever lived. And at the same time, I feel doom. Like I feel a kind of inexorable sense that this is all fragile, that this is all possible to melt away, possibly in fire and brimstone, possibly in some grand catastrophe, possibly just slowly eking its way away from us. So my question is this: the supermarket is amazing. Why do I feel so bad?
Well, I think that I'm going to guess. First, I'm not a psychologist. So I don't know you. So I'm going to assume you're in some ways like a typical guy or a typical person. And I'm going to assume that the feelings I feel are also typical. So I'll tell you why I feel exactly what you're talking about. And maybe it'll have some resonance for you. When you walk into a supermarket, you become suddenly aware of an enormous system that when you're at home or at your office or in your car, is completely invisible to you. And that's partly because you live in a, urban place, if you're like 70% of humankind, or a suburban place, if you're like the other. And so you almost never see actual farms. You almost never see the actual machinery that generates this stuff. So you walk into the supermarket and bang, it's like you're in a factory that you didn't know existed. And the first thing you realize is, holy cow, this is all constructed. And I think there's a natural fear when you see something like this, that is an entire giant space filled with perishable goods that have obviously come in from all different places, that this entire thing could break down. It's kind of the way that I felt about my first computer when I bought a computer of this sort. It did break down all the time. There was this incredibly fragile system, and now it still breaks down all the time. But I've got kind of used to it in a way that, and so I feel like I have some mastery. In the supermarket, I haven't seen it break down yet, but I still have this oppressive feeling. I don't know. That's my opinion. It's when you suddenly become aware of a enormous constructed enterprise that you have very little knowledge of and absolutely no control over.
And these two feelings, the amazement and the catastrophizing, really, the doom, have long intellectual lineages, which I want to get into. You've written a really dazzlingly detailed book, very sweeping history, but also very, very particular, called The Wizard and the Prophet, which is about this kind of contradiction, about this kind of tension. Briefly, what is a wizard? What is a prophet?
Okay, so I should explain where I'm coming from in here. I'm a science writer. I've written a lot about environmental topics. I began 30, 40 years ago working for Science, which is the publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And in that time, I've covered these environmental subjects, and I've talked to just hundreds of people, as journalists do. And over time, I became aware that the kind of answers I was getting to my questions fell broadly into two different camps. And to myself, I named them wizards and prophets. And one was the school that said, look, we're a technical species, a technological species. Science is advancing. And what we'll be able to do for our environmental dilemmas and is essentially produce our way out of things. We are running out of food, we'll produce more. We have air pollution, we'll use high-tech scrubbers. And you're familiar with this, the technical solution guys. And they've had enormous amount of success. It's not like that's a crazy viewpoint. The other is the viewpoint like, wait a minute. We can't do this because there's these limits to nature. We're part of nature. There's these natural limits, and we surpass them to our peril. And if you think about that, these answers are kind of the opposite to each other. One is to say, be smart and make more. And the other one is saying, no, be smart, conserve, stay within the lines. And this tension runs through a huge number of subjects that are sort of underneath the political news from day to day.
So this broad feeling of pessimism has its roots in the difficulty of getting food out of the environment, right? And not just food, but also basically anything, clean water, power, energy of any kind. And I want to go back to an event people probably aren't familiar with. It's quite like an obscure chapter in the history of the world, but it seems really kind of crucial to set up what's going to happen later. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what were the guano wars? Well, maybe actually first, what is guano?
Okay, so guano is a nice word for bird poop. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say what I was actually thinking, but yes, that's what it is.
Feel free.
Okay.
Hugely encouraged.
Guano is a nice word for bird shit. Okay. And the reason that it's important is that guano is exceptionally rich in nitrogen, and not only nitrogen, but a kind of nitrogen that plants can absorb. And to understand why that's important, I have to take a minute-long detour. Is that okay?
Go for it.
All right. So in the early part of the 19th century, researchers, primarily in Germany, discovered the key to how plants grow. And that's photosynthesis, which we've known for a long time. But photosynthesis is an incredibly inefficient system. A tiny fraction of the sun energy gets turned into plant material. And they discovered that the limiting factor was nitrogen, that the more nitrogen you fed plants, the faster photosynthesis would operate and the faster they would grow. And obviously, if you're a farmer, that's really, really important. The idea that nitrogen would be a problem is really weird. And the reason is that the atmosphere is roughly 3/4 nitrogen. And so there's tons of it around. What they had discovered was that the nitrogen in the atmosphere is in a form where you have two nitrogen atoms tied together very tightly that plants can't break apart. Instead, the nitrogen has to be in other combinations. And so what you need to do is fix, as they call it, nitrogen and put it into compounds that plants can absorb. And it turns out that birds are incredibly good at creating that type of nitrogen. Now, there are these sea islands where seabirds have lived for centuries or even thousands of years. And I don't know if you've ever been around gulls, but shitting is something they're incredibly good at. And so there are these islands all over the Pacific and a few in the Atlantic where these seabirds have shat for millennia and had built up deposits that were like 200 feet deep. Now,
Wow.
to a person, these are the most awful places you can imagine. I've been to a couple of them. They're disgusting. They smell. Nothing grows there nothing lives there except for insects and birds. They're horrible. But what they represent is plant food that you can mine. And so when this was discovered, and it was one of the first Europeans to point this out was Alexander von Humboldt, the famous geographer. They created this guano industry in which, in the Pacific, Chinese slaves would mine the guano in horrendous conditions, load it up into ships, and these ships full of shit would go all the way around the tip of South America and go into Europe with this fantastically valuable fertilizer. And this was the beginning of the, high intensity fertilizer industry, which is one of the world's most important industries. And it led to a big political struggle over these guano islands. And in 1869, for example, the United States passed the Guano Islands Act, in which basically any American who happened to pass one of these islands could claim it for the United States. And we claimed 93 of them. The problem is about 40 of them were also claimed by Britain and France and Germany and so forth. And there's this whole low-level fight over the Guano Islands that continued right up into the beginning of the 20th century.
It seems in some way like oil in sort of geopolitical significance. It's
Yes.
a kind of it's a resource that people do battle over because it's essential to all the production processes, in this case, food.
Right. And also, like the oil industry, it had some really unpleasant byproducts. And one of them in this case was that the guano that came from these islands, the Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru, which were the biggest source of guano in the world, also were people grew potatoes there, and that is how the potato blight on these shipments of guano came to Europe. And if you're an English person, I hope you know that during the 1840s there's an awful famine in Ireland, and that was because the blight, which had been a South American disease carried over by guano, came to Europe and wiped out the potato crop in Ireland. Ireland was extremely poor. Roughly 70% of its people ate nothing but potatoes and milk. And the result was a human catastrophe of a sort that hadn't been seen into Europe ever before and wouldn't be seen again until the Holocaust.
Behind the management of the Irish potato famine, right, there was not only sort of material conditions. I mean, that's fascinating. I had no idea that was actually where the blight had come from. But there was also a collection of ideas that seemed to encase this pessimism about nature and what nature could afford people. A very key person in that is, of course, Malthus.
Right.
Could you very briefly explain for people who are not aware, what were Malthus's ideas?
So Malthus was a brilliant guy who had an idea that I think now most people was enormously influential, but now most people regard as overly simple. And what it was that he had observed that human populations could grow really, really fast. And the example that he took was actually the United States, in which had the world's highest population growth rates, the highest ever observed in the late 18th and early 19th century. And he said, essentially, those populations can go up exponentially, but food production cannot go up exponentially. And therefore, the more food we produce, what will happen is that human numbers will inevitably grow and just eat up the food, and we'll be on this edge of misery forever. And this is the ineluctable human condition. And it was no accident, in my opinion, that Malthus had got his training as a minister, because the connection with this idea, with the Christian idea of original sin, is pretty obvious. In original sin, the idea is that there's this taint deep in humankind, and we're ineradicably doomed to fuck things up. And here it was all expressed in semi-mathematical notation that we couldn't improve our conditions. Any idea of progress was just a total illusion and folly. And this has been a powerful message that there is, that we can't get out of these things. And we have to, the only way that Malthus could envision was somehow controlling our births so that we stayed within the lines. And this, obviously sounds familiar to anybody who's concerned about environmental issues today.
The main characters of your book are Norman Borlaug and William Vogt. We'll get to them in a second, but for my money, there's an even sort of more mercurial and complex figure who appears in the early 20th century, and he has to do with this thing we were talking about with guano and the sort of the lack of nitrogen, or the sort of the difficulty of acquiring nitrogen. And that is Fritz Haber, who invents three different technologies that have extraordinarily different contrasting sort of histories that come out of them. On the one hand, the Haber-Bosch process, which is a way of fixing nitrogen, so taking all that abundant nitrogen in the air and making it into something you can actually use on a farm, producing fertilizer and so on. Mustard gas, which is used in the First World War. There's a fascinating story there about his wife. Maybe you can tell us in a second. And then also Zyklon A, which I think is an insecticide or a pesticide, which then is later turned by the Nazis into Zyklon B, which is then used in the gas chambers of the Holocaust. And so on the one side, we have the central thing that makes modern farming possible, and on the other hand, we have the most horrific technology of murder ever devised. And when we're thinking about the wizard and the prophet, we've kind of set up a dichotomy between sort of techno-optimism or techno-pessimism in kind of modern terms. But Fritz Haber seems to embody this tragic aspect of this whole story, which is that the same sort of like chemical processes, the same sort of scientific advances, on the one hand, produce the possibility of vastly more comfort and plenitude for people, and on the other hand, produce the possibility of mass killing. How do you see him in that kind of dichotomy you set up, or does he escape it somehow?
No, I think he's a perfect example of the techno wizard. I mean, these are enormously powerful inventions, and how you react to this guy's career kind of says more about what you value and who your person are than what kind of person you are than anything else. I mean, obviously, mustard gas and Zyklon A are absolutely terrible. At the same time, the Haber-Bosch process, the reason it's called this is that Haber figured out the chemistry for how to take nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form that plants can use, which essentially involves taking nitrogen from the air and turning it into ammonia, and then you can break down the ammonia and turn it into fertilizer. Karl Bosch, the other name in this, is the guy who figured out how to do this on a large scale. And large scale is kind of an understatement here. Fertilizer manufacture is one of the world's major industries, and a good way of describing it is 1% of the entire world's energy supply is devoted to doing this. And the impact of this is just extraordinary. The Vaclav Smil, the earth scientist, has calculated that the fertilizer developed by the Haber-Bosch process goes into the fertilizer that grows about 40% of the world's crops. That if you didn't have this process, the world's food production would be about 40% lower than it is. And another way of saying this is that about 40% of the entire globe's population could not be alive without this process. Think of this. This is 3 billion people or something like that are alive because of Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. And so when you look at this record, the bizarre thing is, even though Zyklon A, which led to Zyklon B, killed 6 million people, the mustard gas, clearly killed 1 million more. That number is actually dwarfed by the number of people that are alive because of Haber-Bosch. And what you make of this, it really is a moral question more than anything else. But you can certainly get a pessimistic view, which is that this supposedly life-saving technology is responsible for one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Or you can say, just consider the benefits are so great that they actually dwarf the greatest atrocity, which sounds pretty inhumane, doesn't it?
It does sound a little bit like...
I don't mean to say that it isn't inhumane. It's just a...
Yeah, I don't know how much I can agree with the sort of like the multiplicative ethics there,
Yeah.
like where you just kind of add up the numbers and so on. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean that's like, what is that? That's like effective altruism, which is that if you kill slightly fewer people than you help, then it's okay, I guess. But at the same time, it would be folly not to acknowledge the fact that this had huge positive benefits.
Yeah. And I should be absolutely clear that Fritz Haber was Jewish.
Yes.
Like, there's no suggestion at all that he
No.
intended for Zyklon A to be used in this way at all. Mustard gas, much more complicated story.
Yeah. Well, he was a patriot.
Obviously, mustard gas was a awful weapon, right? But it has another casualty we should perhaps sort of talk about, which might give you some sort of insight into Fritz Haber's psychology. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, who is a scientist in her own right and a pacifist as well, when she discovers that he has been doing these tests that the German army conducted on in the First World War of mustard gas, he comes back home for a sort of celebratory dinner to say, "Oh, aren't we fantastic? Haven't we done this incredible breakthrough?" During that dinner, she goes up to their room, finds his pistol, and shoots herself in the head, and she dies. And after that event, Fritz Haber, the very next morning, gets back on the train, goes back to the front lines, and carries on with this process of rolling out mustard gas as a munition. It's extraordinary kind of psychological encapsulation of maybe the strange indifference to the individual suffering of human.
Well, it's hard to know because I can't put myself in his shoes. I don't know what I would do if my wife suddenly shot herself. Maybe I might be so totally numb I would just go on autopilot and do whatever it was I was doing, for the next little while. It's such an extreme situation. It's really hard for me to judge. I mean, I'd like to imagine that I wouldn't be such a jerk, but maybe I would.
You probably wouldn't develop mustard gas in the first place.
Yeah, I probably would. But that's as much lack of technical expertise as anything, as any moral superiority.
Do not let Charles Mann do advanced chemistry. He will do awful things with it, is the message I'm getting. Let's go back to those guano islands,
yes.
Right? Because I want to introduce the next character, or so the main character in your book, or the second main character, I guess, William Vogt. Vogt? William Vogt.
And if you're Dutch, it'd be something like Vogt, right? But we don't do that. Right? He's American.
And he spends time on very similar islands. Indeed, I think there are guano islands.
Literally,
what's he doing there? Like, what lesson does he take from the cycles of population of these birds shitting everywhere, these insects, this horrible environment? What does he take from that?
So William Vogt is the prophet of my title, and by now a certain number of your listeners are realizing that you're talking to a guy who wrote a book about two dead guys nobody's ever heard of, and he's one of the dead guys that nobody's ever heard of, but I think is very important. And he was an obscure bird watcher in New York with a talent for organization and rhetoric, who became a kind of self-taught ornithologist. And the government of Peru in the 1930s contacted the American Ornithological Union, which he was active in, and wanted an ornithologist to come to the Guano Islands, the Chincha Islands, off the coast of Peru, to see if he could revive the industry. They wanted to know, as he put it, if you could augment the increment of excrement. And he had a sense of humor. And the idea is, can we produce more? Can we get what can we do? And what he discovered, he went and he lived in these awful places, was that with his wife, the poor woman, was that the birds used the islands to roost, and that's where they laid their eggs. And these birds, especially were these giant cormorants, ate all these anchovetas, which are a kind of cousin of the anchovy, that enormous schools of them go along the coast of Peru. And it so happens that coastal Peru is I think it's still the world's most productive fishery. There's this current of nutrient-rich cold water that goes along the coast there. And the birds live on the islands, which are in the current, and eat the fish, and excrement is the result. But he also discovered that there was this natural phenomenon, which is now called ENSO, or El Nino Southern Oscillation, and which, for reasons that are still not completely understood, periodically the circulation of the air over the Southern Pacific changes, and there's an area that becomes cold becomes hot, and hot becomes cold, and water goes into places that don't normally get it, and so forth. And there's this regular cycle. And when that happens, the cold current that the fish are in becomes warmer, and the fish move out to avoid the warmer water and follow the chain of nutrients, and they go further away than the birds can easily reach. And suddenly their food supply goes down. And this happens no matter what. And he realized there's a ceiling on the number of birds that you can have on the island. You could increase it temporarily, but the next time there was an El Nino cycle, the fish would go away, and the population would just crash to its normal level. There was no way to augment the increment of excrement. You couldn't do it. And he took that idea and said, wait, nature's setting a limit here. Ecosystems have a maximum amount of production because there's always something that sets what you can do. And then he looked at the human enterprise and said, we are exceeding our limits. And he was the first person to put together this idea, which I would argue is the founding idea of the environmental movement, that there's these natural limits set by ecological laws that we cannot surpass. And if we do it temporarily, the result is just a crash. And he wrote, as a result of that, the world's first "We're All Going to Hell" book, in the modern sort, which is called Road to Survival. And if you read that book, and then you've read any other of the major environmental books, Al Gore's book, or The Population Bomb, or Famine 1975, or any of those kinds of things, you will find William Vogt and The Road to Survival right at the base.
Before that, though, so you're saying it's at the base, and I totally agree with you, putting it all together. Before that, there is, again, this extraordinary degree of pessimism that comes sort of just before that book. But this time it's deeply racially twinged. And I wonder if we could sort of snag a little bit on the figure of Madison Grant, who's incredible sort of like polymath seems too kind, right? Because he's also a profoundly racist writer, but he's across both conservationism. He has a great deal of influence over Teddy Roosevelt. He's instrumental in passing the migration bill, which restricts a sort of racial quota, 924 and so on. Right? He's a very central figure in this kind of history of pessimism. But he's also profoundly, as I've already mentioned, a deeply racist sort of thinker.
And they're all
how
entangled.
Much of that goes into Vogt? Like
Yeah.
how much of that is sort of still latent in that kind of that later?
There was so the environmental movement has another root too, which is this idea that we're just destroying things, and that idea was true. So and largely arose in the United States, but it was also elsewhere. And this was the idea that where people come, we're like locusts and we just wreck stuff. And so there was a phenomenon in the 1850s and 1860s called the Great Cutover around the Great Lakes, where there's this enormously wasteful logging that led to some of the world's most gigantic forest fires in the 1870s. And this was immediately followed by the destruction of the bison and the slaughter of all these birds to make feathers for ladies' hats. And a certain number of people, mostly from aristocratic type backgrounds, upper class type backgrounds, looked at this and recoiled. And they said, ugh, what is doing this? We need to clean all this up and restore the natural conditions. And it was a kind of echo of the progressive movement of the time. And one of the things they also believed was improvement, right? These are all kinds of people who, had scientific minds and came out of Darwin. And mixed up in this was not only are we going to restore it to its natural way, but we can make it better. And that they then applied this to humans as well. Darwin's great insight, which is that humans are just a species like any other. They say, well, if we can improve cows and make them better. We can improve humans and make them better. And the standards they did this is better means like us, which is, like me, a white guy, from a waspy background in New England is the, ideal model for the human species. And I hope that some of your viewers are looking at this and thinking, that guy, the ideal model, which gives you some idea of the flaw of the argument. Vogt has this. Vogt has this, but oddly, he's much less of it. It's very possible to read his stuff and come up with disgusting things that he says about brown people. That the Indians breed like codfish or something like this. But he was much less overtly racist because he saw the root of the problem as capitalist greed. In the same, in a way that's very similar to the way somebody like Naomi Klein sees the root of the climate problem in terms of capitalist greed and short-sightedness. And so, Vogt is not a fool. It's not those poor brown people who are running the giant companies. And so he certainly had his moments, but the main target for his ire was not the poor black and brown people, but the giant greedy capitalists.
Let's push forward onto the second character, because Vogt meets him in, I think, 46 in Mexico.
Yes, one time.
Who did he come across? Like in Norman Borlaug.
Yeah.
Who emerges from your story, I have to say, as like a saint, right?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't. He was an amazing guy. They're both amazing guys. Borlaug was, I think, far more comfortable with himself, and he was certainly had his flaws.
Tell us about but okay. Let's park the flaws. Let's tell the people who he was, why he matters for this overall story. Then we'll get into some of the flaws.
Okay, sure. So Norman Borlaug was a farm boy from Iowa, from a very poor part of Iowa, who was lucky enough to be born at the time when things like tractors were coming into existence, and it meant that not everyone on the farm had to be enlisted from day one to work all the time. So he was able to go to school. He became not only the first person in his family to graduate from high school, but the first person to graduate from college. And then he actually got a PhD in plant pathology. Already kind of an extraordinary story. But what tipped it was that by a collection of kind of silly accidents, he was picked by the Rockefeller Foundation to go to Mexico to work on a project to see if he could breed a type of wheat that didn't have a disease that was immune to a disease that's called stem rust. And without going into enormous detail, though I could if you wanted to, stem rust is a constant plague for wheat farmers, and Mexico was totally infested with it, and it has very, very tiny spores. It's a kind of fungus-like disease, and these can get into the upper atmosphere. And the stem rust infestation in Mexico, the spores would get blown as far north as Canada, and so that every year American farmers were being hit by Mexican stem rust, obviously not on purpose. And so it was a kind of two birds at once. You would help a very poor country, and you would also help Americans. And the reason the Rockefeller Foundation was interested in helping Mexico, in addition to its charitable objectives, was that World War II was coming on, and Mexico was so poor and unstable that there was great fear that it would join the fascist side. There'd be a fascist coup, and then that would be bad. And so this was seen as a way of stabilizing the government. The main project was about corn, and they were trying to increase the corn harvest so that people would not be as poor. But Borlaug was shunted to the side to do this one little stem rust project. He was the only member. He had no budget. And he also had this other problem that he was totally the wrong guy for this. He'd never worked for the wheat. He'd never bred plants. He didn't speak Spanish. He'd never been out of the country. He just didn't know anything about the subject.
Why did they pick him?
It was because the people who ran the project were almost as ignorant as him. And they knew stem rust is a disease, and they knew that plant pathology deals with plant diseases. And they knew there was a guy at the University of Minnesota, which is where Borlaug was trained, named Steakman, who was a famous plant pathologist. And they said, do you have a guy who works hard? And they said, yeah. So they picked him. And it was really not much more thought than that. But it turned out to be, from the results, a kind of a genius choice, even though it was totally by accident.
So this is the guy who I say a saint, really, because in some ways, Borlaug is quoted with not him saying himself. He's much more sort of modest and rejects this kind of thing. But people have said, like, Borlaug saved a billion lives, right? Like, enormous contribution. People have said the same things about Edward Jenner, right? Who's the one of the origins of vaccination, right? Who also does things that, from a modern scientific perspective, like inoculating an 8-year-old boy against his consent, like that you would not pass any sort of like contemporary ethical review board. Maybe it's something we can talk about scientific culture there and the kind of the strange mavericks of the past, and not that I'm advocating for anyone to do anything unethical.
Yes,
but that's the reason why I say he's a saint. So he is instrumental in the production of a new kind of wheat. Basically, that sounds incredibly dry. Like, it sounds very sort of you have this phrase in a collection of essays you wrote called MEGO, MEGO. My eyes glaze over. But trust us, this is important and it is fascinating. So what do you want from wheat?
You're right. So what he wants to do is produce something that will be actually worth harvesting, to feed people. And Borlaug has seen hunger in a way that very few people in England today or the United States today have. He saw during the Depression people rioting to get milk. He saw food riots. He saw people who just didn't have enough to eat. And when he went to Mexico, more than half the country was, what the UN would call suffering from food insufficiency, meaning that at some point during the year, they didn't get enough to eat. So he was surrounded by a kind of poverty that is extraordinarily rare today, in large part because of his efforts. And he wanted to do something about it. And he thought that science might offer a chance to do this. And he didn't know how ignorant he was, which is always helpful. And so he, with no tools, working in a shed, he got all these different varieties of wheat that he could, and he laboriously crossbred them. Which involved, in those days, not fancy molecular biology. He didn't know what DNA was because nobody did. Instead, he grew little crops of of the hundreds of different varieties of wheat, and he carefully took the male parts off the flowers and sprinkled all the pollen from another cross and made tens of thousands of crosses, of hybrid types. Then exposed them all to stem rust, took the survivors, and bred them together. And the amount of work that this involved is just staggering. You are sitting on a little stool, under the rather hot Mexican sun with tweezers, picking out individual florets on wheat plants, and then to prevent them from being pollinated from anything else outside, covering each little one with a tiny little paper bag. And doing this hundreds of thousands of times, day after day after day. He didn't have a tractor. He didn't have a plow. He then figured out that you could get 2 crops a year because Mexico's climate is so different in Sonora in the far north and near Mexico City in the Bajío where he was. And so he would do this, half the year near Mexico City in the Bajío, and then half the year in Sonora. And in that farm, he had to plow it himself, which meant that he got a guy to hold the plow, and he would draw it because he didn't have oxen. So this is the part where he is saying it's just an extraordinary amount. He worked like like an animal, like a dog, and he did this for years. And the result was he came up with wheat that was extremely resistant to many, many, many varieties of stem rust. But on top of that, he figured out that he could make it more productive if instead of the wheat being very, very tall, it was short. And that would mean that it would waste less of its energy growing stalk and devote more of it into making seed, which is, after all, the part you eat. So he created what's called dwarf wheat, dwarf hybrid wheat. And this was enormously productive. You could get 3-4 times as much per acre or hectare from his wheat that you could anywhere in the world, that you could anywhere else. And his wheat, moreover, as a kind of accidental byproduct of being bred in 2 radically different climates, was also useful everywhere, almost everywhere in the world. It was kind of like a miracle product in ways that sometimes he didn't himself appreciate. And if I can, I should say this allowed the creation of what is called the Green Revolution package. And that package is, in a way, the most important part of that word, because you need, to produce lots of grain, you need lots of fertilizer. Ordinary wheat, if you just throw more fertilizer, it can only grow so much. This could take advantage of just heaving huge amounts of fertilizer on it. And it also needs a lot of water, which comes from irrigation. So the Green Revolution is this package of 3 things: irrigation, fertilizer, and these hybrid seeds. And the result transformed the world. And the best way to think of it is that in the 1980s, as a result of these enormous changes in wheat, and which were then replicated in rice, sometime in the 1980s, the average person on Earth had enough food to eat all the time. And as far as we know, that's the first time that's happened in human history.
For sure, yeah. This is sort of the whole story of like kind of the thing that I wanted to get to,
Yeah.
because I feel like very often, indeed in myself, and I want to go back to that supermarket, right? Like that feeling that although there is this immense plenitude, and I know that it's sort of like it's abundant and it's there, and I can most of the time afford at least some of it. Right, it is extremely recent and therefore feels fragile. But also,
it is fragile.
And this is where we get, yeah, exactly. So, and this is where we get into the sort of the revenge of the prophets.
Yes, the problem is that there's limited freshwater in the world. It's surprisingly limited. We look at the picture of the globe, and there's all this water there, but that's all salt water. The amount of available fresh water in the world is a sphere that is less than 50 miles in diameter. And that's it for all 8.4 billion people. So there just isn't that much. And already something like 3/4 of the world's water supply goes into irrigation. And so irrigation is a key factor in the Green Revolution, and there just isn't that much water. And we are doing all kinds of things like polluting water, which obviously makes it unusable for irrigation as well as drinking. And we are drawing water from aquifers, which are underground storehouses of water that we're drawing it faster than they can be filled up. And so there's a great worry that a byproduct of the Green Revolution is the destruction of the world's water systems. Then the second thing is that people put on fertilizer. We've made fertilizer cheap. That's good. But because it's cheap, it's pretty easy to overuse it. And there's a lot of farmers who just simply dump too much on their fields, and the fertilizer whooshes off the fields and goes into rivers or lakes, and the rivers go into other rivers and go eventually into the ocean. And the result is creating these huge dead zones. North Sea has got a giant one. The Gulf of Mexico has got one that's about 8,000 square miles. The Bay of Bengal has another one that's about 25,000 square miles, in which the fertilizer has essentially made it so much of it it falls down to the bottom. There's this, it feeds a frenzy of growth by bacteria. The bacteria suck all the oxygen out of the water, and there becomes these areas in which nothing can live. Again, as a sort of accidental byproduct of the Haber-Bosch process. The nitrogen also gets into the groundwater. It gets into the air in different ways, causing various types of nitrogen. So if it wasn't for climate change, nitrogen pollution, which is almost entirely from fertilization, would be the world's biggest environmental problem.
Then there's also the most kind of visceral example I could think of nitrogen runoff and the effects of it is the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt,
Yeah.
which is this enormous belt of sargassum, which is kind of what is it, floating seaweed or
Yeah.
something that kind of stretches from the west coast of Africa all the way across to the Caribbean. This kind of enormous thing. It's periodically there. Sometimes it dissolves. Sometimes it go away again. But it's this enormous belt of this stuff that,
Right.
can wash up on shore, and then produce toxic chemicals. It releases a gas that is highly difficult. Can't breathe it in, and so on. So there are all these kind of cascading problems that come out of this. I want to think about the political problems as well, right? So obviously we talked about Mexico a little bit. This wheat is then kind of rolled out in Mexico. The other interesting case people often talk about is India, right? What happens in India? And maybe we could go back to someone you mentioned a bit earlier, which is Paul R. Ehrlich. You didn't mention him by name, but you mentioned his book, The Population Bomb, which prophesizes, he's a classic example of the prophet, maybe actually the most famous example of the prophet, says the battle to feed humanity is over, by which he means it's been lost. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will die, and so on. That doesn't happen. And largely that doesn't happen. And the reason largely that doesn't happen because there is a transformation in the food structure of India. Talk to us about that adoption of wheat in India.
Okay, so it's important to understand how poor people were, the human species was, at the time that we're talking about. The UN is formed at the end of the war. They create the Food and Agricultural Organization in, I think it's 1948. They do the very first global survey of hunger. And they find that something like 40% of the world is undernourished. And that there's only, I think it's 17%, you'll have to check me on this, of the world that they count as like well-nourished. So that's, 3/4 or more of the people on the planet are either just barely scraping by or worse than scraping by. And one of the epicenters of poverty there is India. And regrettably, India, which has become this symbol of overpopulation and all this, but a great big factor in that, sorry to say this, is that the British, it was a rich place and the British Empire kind of looted it for for like 100 years. And so
this is not a controversial take on this show. This is fine.
Look, the United States isn't where I'm speaking from isn't without blame in these issues. I always feel a little awkward pointing to somebody else when our own record is so terrible. But anyway, so you have this country that's been impoverished and has had, the beginnings of healthcare, vaccination, and so forth. And so there's this extraordinary population rise, which is compounded by the Indian government. Now, the independent Indian government is conscious of the fact that India has been looted of its industrial base by Britain, which is, what happened, and they want to build it back. As a result, they neglect their agricultural sector, and things really go to hell. And there's a bunch of famines there in the 60s, real awful famines where people don't produce enough food. And this is the environment that Borlaug walks into, and he convinces by the sort of he was an extraordinarily kind of charismatic guy, and he beats them up, both India and Pakistan, into trying out his wheat. And the results are extraordinary there. And there's all kinds of stories of that from people who are still living about how they produced so much that it overwhelmed the village's storage facilities, and they had to, fill up the schools with all the wheat. This extraordinary thing that happened to them, and it had a lot to do with the fact that India had a terrible drought in the 1970s. But just a couple of years after Paul Ehrlich wrote his book, and he and it didn't happen. The disaster didn't happen. And should I talk about Ehrlich a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Ehrlich, brilliant guy. He's a butterfly specialist, and has the idea, this is again this foundational Darwinian idea, that the laws of nature apply equally to people and to butterflies. And if butterflies breed too much, there isn't enough food in their habitat. If there's too many monarch butterflies and there's not enough milkweed, the monarchs will die. And a central question is, are we like the monarch? Are we like the protozoa? Or because we have, the gift of our brains, can we alter the environment in ways that make it more productive for us and get away with this? Ehrlich is the school of no. And he writes this book, The Population Bomb, that becomes, this enormous, has enormous impact. I went to college. I'm old. I went to college in the 1970s, and I had the population bomb in 3 of my classes. Ecology, political science, and sociology. All taught it because it was so riveting. And that book very famously begins with his first trip to Delhi. And he is horrified by the number of poor people there. And he says, this is the future. And, we're all going to be like Delhi, and this can't last, and it's going to die. It's an extremely vivid passage. What Ehrlich didn't know was that the number of people in Delhi was because the government had deliberately built a bunch of factories there and invited people in to work in these, factories, but hadn't been able to provide enough housing. So it was entirely a man-made disaster. Delhi at the point had less than 4 million people. Paris had 8 million people, but so it didn't have anything to do with inherent crowdedness of people, but it had to do with political arrangements. And this is a big flaw in this kind of argument, because people have the ability to really change their political and social arrangements in the way that, say, bees or butterflies don't, and do it rapidly.
And so the Green Revolution comes in, but it also has the effect of exacerbating exactly that collection of problems, right?
Right.
So
yes, exactly.
We get slums because of the Green Revolution, because land becomes valuable and people want to take it.
You're actually because India has these very weak social institutions, not least because they've just recovered from being conquered by a foreign government. And so if you're a peasant, a poor guy out in the countryside, and your land can suddenly produce 3 times more wheat than it did the day before, it becomes 3 times more valuable, and it becomes worth stealing. And one of the laws of human nature is that there are always unscrupulous rich people. All you have to do is read Balzac to know that. And these unscrupulous rich people come in and they scoop up the valuable land. And so you get these bizarre but rational responses to the Green Revolution. Like there is an attempt in what is now Bangladesh, I write about this in The Wizard and the Prophet, to install what are called this new kind of well, which will allow farmers to irrigate their crops and cheaply and increase their productivity. And the villagers all smash them because they know that this will lead to their land being stolen.
Yeah. And so the class politics of it, right,
are terrible.
To speak in that language, right? There's a militarization of the countryside at the same time, because there is a need to control the social process. This is perhaps an overused reference sometimes, but James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State, right? In some ways, the Green Revolution seems to bring about those same kinds of process of control of people's lives, even as it liberates them from the destruction, the absolute wastage of hunger. You get this, you could out of the frying pan into the fire, perhaps not.
Well,
perhaps the fire's a bit preferable there, but there's a kind of, it's a problem.
The writer Bruce Sterling has put it, one of my favorite lines is, there is no victory condition for being human. Sorry, you don't get it. Okay. So, and it's true. This is, by the way, not something that just happened in India. Now, as I recall, you guys over there in Europe, and I'm going to loosely include England and Europe at the moment, even though you guys apparently don't want to be there, um, is
No comment.
you have the gilets jaunes, right? The guys with the yellow vests.
Yeah.
And who are they? They are rural people who have been screwed over by the system. And live in these communities that have been emptied out and hollowed out, and there's nothing there but these giant inhuman farms and factories that produce the process that's in the farms. And this is true in the Middle West. It's true in India. It's true in China. It's true almost everywhere in the world. And this is all because of the fact that the enormous productivity of the Green Revolution was met by governments, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, wherever, by saying, oh, we can get this, quote, stagnant labor out of the countryside and have them all go and work in cities and do something more productive. And the result was the hollowing out of rural communities everywhere in the world, and which is, deeply entwined with the rise of right-wing populism now. And, when I go to, Western Nebraska, and I see, I'll see these little towns that used to be vibrant places with, empty storefronts and Trump signs. I'm looking at, one of the consequences of the Green Revolution. And those places, I say thriving, meaning that they're full of people. Those people were working like dogs and had limited life expectancies and often didn't have electricity, but they were full places. And so now all those people who used to be there are living in the suburbs and having a nice life, but there's wreckage left behind, and that's an inadequate. That's the fault of the government's inadequate dealing with the consequences of the Green Revolution that they themselves fostered.
Wow, that's really fascinating, because we hear a lot about deindustrialization, right? Mm-hmm. But we rarely hear about de-agriculturization,
right,
which almost makes it sound like a sort of a thing from a whole other epoch.
Right.
I mean, Iowa certainly, and other states as well, had incredibly well developed farms from before the Green Revolution, in part because of favorable conditions and so on. But that's
right.
You're bringing that agricultural change into the present, like into 2010s,
right? I mean, and Norman Borlaug is an example. He works on the farm. Because of technological innovation, he's able to leave the farm, and so are two of his sisters. So the community Saude, which is the name of it, shrinks. It's a quarter the size it once was. Some of the places end up with no kids taking over the farms. Those are bought by the neighbors, and the result is consolidation. So you have fewer people, bigger farms, more machines, and that's not a recipe for a healthy social fabric.
Yeah, I've had it on the screen long enough for people who've been watching the video, so I'm going to have to ask you about it. I want to go back to India, and I want to ask about the gamma rayed wheat.
Oh,
because this is an amazing section. Just like the thinking about the use of sort of high science technologies in the 1950s, you would not expect them to be applied to the food, really.
Right.
But can you just talk us through that story? Like, what are people doing with gamma rays and wheat?
Well, it's kind of funny. This is one of those stories in which the levels of irony are piled up so high. So Nehru, this remarkable guy who's the first and long-serving prime minister of India after India becomes independent, is filled with this vision of wanting to modernize India and make it a powerful modern country, which to his mind means industry and heavy industry, concrete, fertilizer, steel, and so forth. And agriculture is sort of irredeemably backwards. And he, just as much as Harry Truman or Eisenhower, wants to get people out of the countryside and into the cities, where he wants to end what Marx called rural idiocy. These illiterate, ignorant peasants. It's kind of like, And it's no accident that he's a pretty high class guy, and he looks down his nose at the lower class people. And we're talking about castes, of course, in much the same way that an Oxford or Eton person kind of looks down at the yobs in England, or people like me, waspy university guys, go to Missouri and see the local yahoos, right? It's the same kind of prejudice against them, and he wants them out there. This leads to a dramatic starvation, as I said, of the agricultural sector. Borlaug comes in. Now, Borlaug, though, is a technologist. He thinks like an engineer. And one of the besetting problems of engineers is when people come to engineer types with human concerns, they look at it sort of logically and completely miss the point. So if you've been to India, you know that people eat roti and chapati, and that these are made out of white wheat. And the whiteness of them is like a whole big deal. It's like, and this is not unknown to Europeans. A French person would not want a baguette made out of pumpernickel, right? Or coarse German, right?
Yeah.
A baguette is that. And you tell the French people, oh, the pumpernickel, it's just as nutritious. That's not an argument that's going to sail, right? So Borlaug comes in with Mexican wheat. Mexican wheat is not white, it's red. It's a different color. And Borlaug looks at this and says, well, why do they care? It's just as nutritious. And he's right about that, but he's also a complete blockhead. So this is a big problem. And so what happens in India is really something quite remarkable. There's a guy in India who doesn't get enough attention. First, I should say when I talk about India being poor and so forth, there are also just huge numbers of scientists there, because India is so big. There's huge numbers of everything, right? And so there are scientists there that he works with, and we can go on about this, who take his wheat and they expose it to gamma rays, with an early kind of particle accelerator, if you like, and they just blast it to induce mutations. And I have to stress how idiotic this idea is, because we now know this is happening in the late 50s, just after the discovery of DNA and RNA and so forth, but they know nothing about it, and they know nothing about really how the genes work. This is like you're saying, we want to change the color of a watch, let's hit it with a hammer. And so this guy, Swaminathan, but he doesn't know, he takes a bunch of the seeds, he exposes them to gamma rays, he plants them, and the unbelievable thing is that this entirely ridiculous procedure works. He actually gets white wheat out of it, a stroke of luck. And then, because he's, unlike Borlaug, he's not a complete blockhead, he names it an Indian name, so that he names it after things that are in India. And so he produces this very highly productive wheat that is in a form that Indian people like. And the results are just extraordinary, because to the people he's giving it to, this white stuff that is actually the production of, a gamma ray mutation is natural. And what
and
what Borlaug was trying to tell them was a completely other level of artifice, but so that there's this elaborate high tech process that results in something that is now accepted because it's natural.
So I think and that's an extraordinary kind of moment of irony to think through, of course. I think we've come to a moment in history where, as you're saying, lots of this has been forgotten. It's been sort of so deeply normalized that it feels almost absurd to think about the where your food comes from at all, right? As a practice, maybe you have a sort of cultural idea of where it comes from, but not like a technical or practical idea of like, from this farm using this technique and so on. We are back in the era of the prophets, I would say.
Yeah.
I think broadly, culturally speaking, we're back in that sort of catastrophic era. Do you see that as? Do you see climate change as one of those moments where we get another kind of tragic reversal, where the best laid plans of our, as we've been talking about, the kind of nitrogen cycle of the Haber-Bosch process comes back to bite us at some sort of larger level?
Yeah.
Do you think that how do you see those arguments as they operate?
So the climate change is a byproduct of fossil fuels, and it's tremendous.
Also land use change, right?
And land use change, yeah. But 75% of the emissions are really from fossil fuels, and the rest are from agriculture. And the fossil fuels are this great thing. They're energy, huge amounts of energy packaged in a relatively safe form that can be transported all over the world and ignite. And they're just an amazing thing. And if it wasn't for the fact that they're going to kill us all, it would be an absolutely wonderful thing, for forever and ever. And we'd be worried about running out of fossil fuels. But unfortunately, we have the terrible bad luck that, the byproducts of this carbon dioxide just happens to work with the chemistry of the atmosphere in such a way that it traps heat on the Earth and causes all these terrible environmental problems. And so, we just have tremendous bad luck here that this otherwise rather amazing boon to the human species, and one that much of our prosperity depends on, has got this problem that has these at least some potential existential risks. I should say I have a slightly weird take on climate change. So
we love weird takes.
Okay. So one of the things that if you study climate change, you realize two things. That because you can't run experiments, like there's not this second Earth, almost everybody has to go with these models. And the models are some of the most sophisticated objects ever created by human being, but modeling the entire Earth, is not an easy task. And you also want your models to be consistent. So in the 1990s, scientists came up with a number of models of what might happen. They were mainly done to illuminate things that scientists needed to know, rather than, attempts by like companies that think tanks do to model where the world might go. Their models are scientific in origin, but they're the ones we have, and people stick to them because you obviously want to be consistent. And the model that they used for business as usual, which had a technical name of RCP 8.5, assumed there's going to be roughly 10 times as much coal use in 2100 as there was in 1980, and that's not going to happen. But because there's so much valuable stuff to it, people continue to use it, and people continue to use these models that our own policies have rendered obsolete. And the result is that there's a distinct pessimistic bias in the projections. And as far as I can tell, the real scenarios that are likely to happen are better than that. But there's two things there. First, we're nowhere out of the woods. It's just that, when people say there's been no progress, that's not true. It's just simply not true. But also when people say there's no problem, that's also not true. And the second thing that I worry about is that these models are inexact, and there are enormous potentials for surprises. And it's very hard for me to finish this sentence for me. Gee, I'm so glad we're randomly fooling with the constituents of the atmosphere because. Right? Yeah. So, I'm a little bit more, I'm more worried about the surprises than anything else. So you should know that that's kind of thing. Oh, you have the 8.5 scenario there.
Yeah.
And this is unfortunately because scientists like to have research that has impact and are rewarded for that and rewarded for the headlines that they generate. It means that they have a good excuse to use this both scientifically because it's designed in such a way as to show the impacts of whatever it is that you're studying, and because it produces very scary results. And so there's a kind of institutional bias to using the worst possible models, even though that they've been rendered very likely obsolete.
I guess two things to say on that, right? One is that the IPCC as a whole, because it works by consensus, has an opposite bias towards conservatism and sort of moderation in its views about what might happen. And so it says that things are, probably won't happen. The things that not everyone agrees will happen, it says it downgrades the likelihood of those things. So I guess that's a countervailing tendency to the one that you're describing, which is an institutional process rather than a sort of a individual scientist trying to get, some sort of individual clout or sort of impact. And I guess the other one is that, from my impression, what's happened over the last, say, 10 years or even 5 years of climate modeling is that we've done two things. One is shut out and, not exactly disprove, but like make much less likely the extreme ends of climate sensitivity. So we say, okay, well, we're not going to get to like 6 degrees warming by the end of the century. That's definitely not going to happen, or very likely not to happen. Of course, this is modeling science, right? So it's never quite like certain. But we've also, to some extent, excluded the kind of the lower third of models, right? So we're actually on that kind of like upper 2/3 of how bad it could be currently, and sort of narrowing that down slowly. And the third thing, I said there were two, there are actually three, is the discovery of tipping points, right, inside the overall system. So, obviously the big one people know about is the permafrost melting, releasing methane and so on, which will further exacerbate warming. Aren't those all kinds of things that you would not necessarily say, well, therefore the worst models will happen, or therefore the worst scenarios will happen? But they are things that where you would say, actually, we have a much more spiky model here of the kinds of upper ends of the extreme risks. Isn't that kind of thing that should be taken?
Yeah, that's what I meant by the surprises. I mean, we don't really understand the permafrost. It's very poorly mapped. And there's all kinds of stuff like the assumptions about tree growth rate and so forth are all from these studies of, the Canadian boreal forest back in the 1960s. So that, there's lots of assumptions underneath these things that are quite shaky. And this is not because climate scientists are bad or something. It's just because the problem is super hard to get good data on everywhere in the world, right? And so I would put the kind of thing of the permafrost melting in the category of surprise. Things we don't know. I'll give you another example of things we don't know that happened during the time that I was writing The Wizard and the Prophet. I'm very friendly with a prominent climatologist. One day he comes to dinner and he's like shaking. And the reason is the IPCC has always assumed that Antarctica would be unlikely to break up just because it's such a gigantic piece of ice. And they've asked him and a couple colleagues at the University of Massachusetts to check out this assumption. This is good science. And he realizes there are physical mechanisms that exist that could cause Antarctica to break up far faster than anybody had thought.
This is the West Antarctic ice shelf.
Yeah, and the reason is because of natural variations in wind and rain and so forth. Antarctica is not like flat; it's got these dips in it. In those dips, when it's warm, collect water. But the same thing happens under the bottom of the ice sheet too. There's currents. There's random fluctuations of water, and so there are thinner and thicker pieces of the ice from the bottom. And when you do the statistics, which is what Rob did, there's more chance than you would expect that a thin place on top and a thin place on the bottom would be near each other. And that's what happened in a bunch of cases. And if that would happen, the ice could break up if they were configured properly. And so the ice, it is actually literally theoretically possible that Antarctica could break up by 2100. That would be a catastrophe. There'd be relatively rapid sea level rise of several meters. It would just be awful. And that was a complete surprise. It's not accounted for in any of the models, and it's a catastrophic risk. This is the part where I say, why is it good to be fussing with the atmosphere, right? Because people like Rob might discover it's going to end the world in some completely unexpected way. So that's the kind of thing that, as I said, I really worry about, is what we don't know. And that's why I would personally want us to put pedal to the metal to get it. The sort of standard thing with the models, it's so blurry that I don't know that we've certainly eliminated the top. We've probably eliminated the bottom, but in between is a huge swath from maybe okay, a little difficult to woo, this is bad, and we just don't know where we are there.
One of the really kind of interesting moments in the book is where you talk about Harry Truman, I think it is, who has this idea that growth is going to become a policy of the United States.
Yes.
And this is, coming from the left, right, broadly speaking, this is kind of a surprise to me. Not that they would have that policy, but that they wouldn't think that that was a tendency inherent in the structure of capitalism itself. Right? So often on the left, we say, well, it's not that people have policies or governments want to do growth. It's that capitalism must grow in order to survive, right? It's a sort of a moving object in the world. It's a moving social relation, to use kind of the jargon, right? And in that sense, I do not think, just to put my cards on the table, I do not think that we are likely to be able to restrict growth, because it's not a policy choice. Right? It is actually a kind of like a material necessity of the way in which capitalism works. And therefore we get to the situation where there is the real risk of us having to mess with the atmosphere, right? Because of geoengineering. Talk us through, and this, if anyone's been following this conversation from the beginning, as I hope they have, I think there is a sort of a hopefulness in the way you tell the story, right? Which is the story of the wizards, the extraordinary inventions, and so on. Where does geoengineering fit inside that story?
So the hope I would talk about like this is this. I would argue that we simply don't know what's going to happen. And because we don't know what's going to happen, it's impossible to rule out the possibility. It's impossible to rule out the chance of a positive outcome. Right? If you don't know, you can't say it's definitely going to end bad because you don't know. And I think we always live in ignorance, but perhaps particularly in here, because in climate change, even with the best knowledge we have, we don't, there's very good arguments that we are, going to be right at the edge of catastrophe in 2100, and also really good arguments that no, we'll be, we're going to have some big issues, but we've always had big issues. So, here's a positive outcome. What I mean, even as climate change is happening, other things are happening. One is electrification. If you've ever been in rural Africa or rural South Asia or something, and so over time, the difference between the time when the lights come in and the time before is just huge. I went to Bihar, which is in northeast India, is one of the poorest parts of India, sort of notoriously poor. And I happened to be in a village that had just got installed a kiosk, which had a big solar panel and could charge up batteries. And people could then get the batteries charged up there and have these lights in their home at night. And it meant kids could do their homework. It meant that grandmothers and mothers could do these home industries. They roll these cigarettes called BD. It meant the dad who had been working in the fields all day could listen to the soccer game. Just having a little bit of electricity is a huge, huge, huge deal. And there's 1.3 billion people in the world without electricity. So let me ask you, if we get down at the bottom range of climate change, where you're not talking about gigantic disasters, but you are talking about losing coral reefs and lots and lots of other not good things, but you also have those 1.3 billion people who have electricity. Is that a bad future?
No, for sure. I mean, like I think that but I think it's the moral quandary we find ourselves in, right? It is that it doesn't seem like. And I want to talk about this earlier in the sort of the Green Revolution story, because someone like Raj Patel has written a sort of another history of that,
Yeah.
which is, I guess, more sort of aggressively rooted in the kind of the political kind of framework that he's thinking through.
Yeah.
And part of his argument there is
It's
that
a great book.
we think about
You're talking about Stuffed and Starved?
Yeah.
Yeah, great book.
Yeah, exactly. And he's thinking about, and I think I'm also thinking about the article in the Journal of Peasant Studies, which name I've forgotten. He's thinking about, he says, well, the Green Revolution is kind of a misnomer, right? Because what we're really thinking about here, when we're thinking about this enormous decrease in absolute rates of hunger, absolute rates of poverty, a massive chunk of that is China. And, you know, it's really a kind of red revolution, right, in a sense, or it's a kind of green revolution, right? What do you make of that as, you know, the real driver here is essentially it's ambiguous now, certainly. I don't know if you would call it capitalist or socialist. It's beyond me. But, you know, what do you make of this, that this is a kind of a revolution with an absolute reduction in poverty with a very different social base? Well, like, how does that fit in?
Well, I mean, first off, China, you know, the Han are the world's most successful ethnic group. And that's been like the case forever, you know, basically, except for a brief period in the late 18th all the way through the 19th century when England and the Europeans were exploiting them. But otherwise, what happens in China sort of rules the world. And so it's not really surprising that if you're talking about these large scale changes in the human condition, what happened in China is a big driver for them. But oddly, what happened in China is not that different from what happened in India, which is a very different place, or Latin America. And in China, the International Rice Research Institute developed the IR8, this, you know, Borlaugian type of, you know, universal rice. The various state rice bodies adapted it for local tastes and local customs, the way Swaminathan did for India, although they didn't use gamma rays. And then these state apparatuses, you know, unveiled it. Agriculture has always, you know, been entwined with the state. Well, anyway, not always, but for centuries has been entwined with the state. And in that respect, China and the United States are less different than you might think, or China and England, in that, you know, look at right now, Trump has messed up the soybean market for the U.S., and now he's promising to use the levers of the state to make the farmers whole. And this is, you know, not that different from what China does when its government messes up the market for rice or soy or potatoes, which is to use the levers of government to make people to make people whole. So I would argue that it's the Green Revolution. It is absolutely true that it was driven by China, but that's because of numbers, not because of the peculiarities. It's more because of numbers than the peculiarities of the Chinese state. Because what happened in Brazil, really different place, is not that different.
We've been talking mostly about The Wizard and the Prophet, which is a great book, people should read it. But you've also written a collection of essays called How the System Works in the New Atlantis. People should also read that. Yeah. It's in 4 parts, and we've sort of touched on a few of them, right? Food distribution, the clean water, basically, electricity system, and public health. And I was kind of thinking, as we're talking about the you know, Trump and things you said earlier about the sort of de-agriculturalization leading to Trump, I was wondering what the connection is between having these massive, complicated systems and essentially a kind of a conspiratorial culture where the way of making sense of all the complexity, particularly around public health, right, in the COVID-19 pandemic, you get these kind of almost wild conspiracy theories, certainly. I mean, I would say some of them were deeply paranoid.
Bonkers is the
yeah, but bonkers is well. I mean, some of them.
Yeah.
Like other ones, I want to say, okay, you can explore that question.
Yeah.
Like some of them are definitely bonkers. How do you see the connection between complexity, scale, and particularly the way that power and opacity, right, like systems that are opaque by design, just because they don't want to have bureaucratic accountability, or because they don't want people to be able to understand the kind of wastage or misery or free labor or free nature that kind of goes into them, right? What link do you see between that endless expansion of the complex systems and something like, conspiracy theories?
I think they're very tightly related. And if you think about it, most of us don't have really any idea how the electric grid works, where it is. You pay your bill to some entity that nowadays, especially, typically has some ConEx right? It's quite it's remote from you, and you feel like you have no choice. You're dependent on it, but you can't affect it in any way. The same, I think, is true for the agricultural system. It's true for the public water system, and it's especially true for the public health system. And the public health system and the agricultural system, I think, are particular flashpoints. One is that food is this enormously cultural thing, right? We talked about how, to French people, bread is a baguette. It's not a loaf of pumpernickel. To Mexicans, it's tortilla is, a certain thing. It's not something else. And it's, what you have at home, what you have. My wife is East Asian, and her comfort food is a bowl of Japanese rice with Japanese pickles on it, right? And her parents, who had lived in the United States, for 50 years, would still sniff if we deign to give them Chinese rice or God forbid, American rice, right? And in some level, this is irrational. But it's also because people have really deep feelings for it. And this thing that means home to you, that's really deep, is provided by these giant faceless corporations like ADM and Cargill and so forth. And there's a real suspicion that those people do not have your best interests at heart. And I think that situation absolutely invites conspiratorial thinking. And then in particular, when those people become part of the technical elite. And so you have, what's his name, Rob Fraley at Monsanto saying, we're going to gene edit this and so forth. And I know what I'm talking about because I'm a PhD and you're an idiot, which was kind of the message that they gave. And people don't like being condescended to, and they, for good reason, and they don't like somebody saying, I'm smarter than you and I'm going to do what's best for you. And you add this on top of the situation where these giant faceless corporations are providing something that's really important to you, and it's ripe for making people unhappy and feel something's wrong. And I think people are very, very good at diagnosing when something is wrong, although they're less good at coming up with what the answer is. And this is even worse in public health, where it's all a bunch of doctors. Doctors are, this is a sociological explanation. I don't know if I could prove this by data, but it every time I've ever mentioned this to a public health person, they go, yeah, it's true. So, doctors are trained to make life and death decisions for people who don't really understand what's going on. They have to have a kind of hubris to do this. You need to do this. You need to be able to tell people to do something, even if they don't get it. And that mentality is a problem for public health, because almost every public health measure involves asking you to take some inconvenience or loss or problem to benefit the majority. When you are told you have to wash your hands to go back to work, that's a nuisance. Most people accept it. But, when it comes to things that really freak people out, like having everybody in the streets wearing masks, that's a whole other thing. And to have it being done by these faceless people you don't really trust, who on top of that are condescending and are frequently telling you don't understand, it's a very volatile, bad combination.
Is that how you see the origins of MAHA, the Make America Healthy
Some
Again
of it, yeah.
movement?
People have an image of food, in part sponsored by the food industry itself, of, this is all from friendly Farmer John, right? and instead, you go to the market, and it's replete with images of smiling vegetables and this sort of thing. But what's actually happening is this giant process of shipping stuff around internationally from faceless multi-billion companies, and the disconnect between your image of what you like and feel comfortable with and what is actually happening is just really, really high.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, the cultivation of a homeliness that is in fact the product of a vast transnational system
Sure.
of production. Yeah,
you
it's
go
quite the irony.
and you go to the store, and until recently, you could buy Aunt Jemima maple syrup that was not made by Aunt Jemima. It was not maple syrup, right? But it had this picture of this friendly black lady, slightly racist picture of this friendly black lady, right? And that kind of marketing is ubiquitous.
Where are we at? Because so part of the sort of the broader movement that we're looking at in America right now, right, contains Maha, also contains very serious cuts to science funding, also contains a sort of bureaucratic complexity, right, that I think lots of scientists find very frustrating. And I'm interested in this at two levels. Like, where are we at with the sort of culture of science? Where are we at with the kind of the culture of science inside the kind of bureaucracies of it, or inside the kind of the actual process of doing it? And then a question that we talked about the other day when we had our sort of pre-chat is, how do we overcome this sort of split between people who see themselves as like acting inside science and people who see themselves as being sort of more humanities focused, more focused on politics and so on? Because without knowledge of both, or without at least a cursory knowledge of both, right, there is a sort of a strange flatness to life, at least I find. How do we overcome that at both those two different levels, right? Both amongst the sort of the scientists themselves and the people who might aspire to become amateurs of the scientific sort of process.
I think that there's okay, so now you're asking, I mean, I think mostly in this, our talk, we've been talking about things that are, historical record and are factual. I should say for the last few minutes, we've been drifting, further into speculation. So I hope that your listeners are, I don't know, applying some kind of discount, So I'll tell you what
that's when I start to really pay attention.
Yeah. No, I'll tell you what I think. I've been telling you what I think, but as this is going on, it's getting increasingly remote from anything that I could actually feel like I could prove. And so, as long as we have that kind of caveat in there, I'm happy to tell you my opinion. But if people listen to this and think that guy's an idiot, they might be right? And so, how do we heal, or if you want, I don't even know if heal this divide between the fact that a lot of the technologists and experts are locked up in this kind of box where they peer out from at the masses and with a little bit of disdain, and the masses who sense this disdain and use it to spiral into doing their own research, and which on the internet.
I love when people say the name of the show.
Yeah. Do your own research, which especially on places like Twitter is often a sign of craziness coming, right?
That's why you call it this. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I think it's complicated, and it was and it's been talked about for a while. You should, Edmund Husserl, the philosopher, back in the 20s and 30s, had this way of talking about it, that he said that what science does is it simplifies things so to find out important principles, but along the way, and it makes things comfortable and easy. But along the way, the people who live in that world of science make the mistake again and again of thinking that simplified world that they live in bears some relationship to the actual world. And when people act in these, quote, irrational or ways, they're appalled, and there gets to be this divide. And Husserl saw it as leading to irrational fascist political movements, and he saw this as one of the well springs of National Socialism and fascism and so forth. And the history of the past 10 or 15 years does nothing to me to suggest that Husserl got this one like way wrong. You take the management of COVID. The fact was, this was a novel disease, and we didn't know anything about it. And so any advice that health experts could give you would all be generic advice, like, wash your hands, try to avoid contact and so forth. But it wasn't based on actual knowledge of this. And as a result, they were defensive overwhelmingly and were giving obiter dicta. They were saying, do this, do this, do this. Not once did they say, this is our general idea, but keep listening because some of this is going to be wrong. Nobody said, we think that you should probably limit social distancing and wear masks. But nobody said, you know what? There's never been a proper community study of a mask. Instead, when your guys' Cochrane collaboration wrote that, which I think happened right at the height of the COVID, it was shouted down that the evidence for community use of masks was terrible, that whether they were effective or not. That it was the empirical base of everything that they were saying was extremely bad and squishy. And I think that they would have been better off if they'd leveled with people and said, this is what we know now or think we know, it's going to change. And so don't say, you said this, we're just telling you what we think now.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a strange absolute authority that is given to science, and then as soon as it goes wrong, it is immediately withdrawn. Right? There's a kind of a difficulty in communicating, just like sheer degree of uncertainty.
Yeah, and also trade-offs. For example, there's a sort of a brutal story, so I apologize in advance. My sister is a special ed teacher, meaning that she's one of these heroic people who, for not very much money, teaches the most difficult students. She loves her students. She's fantastic. When they had the lockdowns, those kids were terribly affected. The idea of taking an 8-year-old with special needs and teaching them by Zoom is ludicrous. And so these, it was terribly destructive. And it was also hugely problematic for their parents, because these aren't kids who can be latchkey kids. They had to make arrangements for them. And it was enormously difficult for them. Some of her parents lost their jobs. So there's a very serious trade-off for the lockdown for her. But as soon as they got back in school, those kids couldn't wear their masks. They're little kids. They're running around like mad. My sister got COVID. She didn't know it. She passed it to my mother, and my mother died. So how do you weigh those things? The lockdown would have saved my mother, and it would have been really horrible for a whole bunch of little kids. And that kind of frank discussion where there's no real obvious answer, again, no, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing, a kind of fake certainty. And it angered me at the time, even before I had such personal experiences with it.
I'm so sorry. That's it's horrible. I want to turn at the very end now to the future, right? Mm-hmm. We've been sort of speaking in a speculative mode. I want to kind of perhaps go even harder on that.
Pedal to the metal, as we say.
Yeah. All gas, no brakes.
Yeah,
that's a different YouTube show.
Yeah,
great stuff. But not this. You have talked about C4 photosynthesis. We've touched on geoengineering. Mm-hmm. We've talked a little bit about GMO, genetically modified organisms. I'm not sure if you write about vertical farming or permaculture, but I think these are sort of things in the mix that have this kind of utopian and dystopian energy, right? Certainly geoengineering straddles the two, depending on who you ask.
Urban farming, I would arguably say too.
Really? I mean, synthetic meats and so on seem like they are kind of panaceas for, you get meat proteins, which are very important, but without the suffering of the animals and without all the kind of the complexities of,
Yeah.
the farming methods. Why are they not a panacea?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's the practical reasons why they might not be panaceas. First, this is obviously projecting into the future. A mug's game, right? So take all this with a grain of salt. But as for now, there's a practical reasons, which is that it takes a lot of energy and a lot of work to grow, say, if you read Neuromancer, the William Gibson novel,
Yeah.
they eat what he calls vat-grown salmon. It's sushi, right? That's been grown in a vat. But the salmon muscle is a combination of 2 or 3 types of muscle cells and fat cells, and also some kind of connective tissue whose name I used to know and I've forgotten. So to grow vat-grown salmon, you have to grow all these types of cells and then mix them together in a way that seems meat-like and not like a slurry. And that's a formidable technical challenge. The second thing is why it might seem dystopian is when that's going to happen. The only way it seems likely to happen is if you can have economies of scale, which is true of the rest of the food industry. So it's not really a surprise. So you're going to have, not, mom and pop, Farmer John growing the vat-grown salmon. It's going to be Monsanto or Archer Daniels Midland or some huge biotech company growing them in gigantic industrial facilities. The vats will be not bathtubs, but the size of airplane hangars. And there will be, gigantic robots for cleanliness, stirring the vats and mixing them together. And it will look very different than what we think of as a farm or a fish yard. And it'll be controlled by the exact same billionaires that people are suspicious of already.
But isn't the question of sort of aerating because in an animal you have a vasculature, right? You have veins and then you have these capillaries and arteries and so on, right? Like that's a terrible technical definition of how blood works, but big things branching, right? But I thought one of the main challenges with synthetic wheat, as far as I understand it, is that you don't have this like built-in vasculature,
right.
And so, but then when you stir it, because in order to aerate it, you get these kind of torsion effects, and the cells rip. And as they rip, they spill out all this kind of internal sludge, and you get this cascading die-off across the vat. Right, and that's my understanding of the technical problem. That's
that's what I was alluding to when you say somehow they're going to solve that, and the way they're going to solve that is not going to be Farmer John with a canoe paddle, stirring it in an artisanal manner, but it's going to be some very elaborate technical and expensive solution that will be highly, involve lots and lots of capital, which will mean that the person who's going to do it is not going to be, as I said, Farmer John, but it's going to be Elon Musk. Or Larry Ellison or somebody like that.
God forbid it be Larry Ellison. But
sure. Nice guy. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think that they're going to be a nice guy, and there's how much are you going to feel? What are people going to feel about eating artificial sushi that is grown by Elon Musk? I would wager that a significant percentage of them will not say, "Oh, well, this is eliminating the suffering from live fish." They're going to say, "I'm feeding Elon Musk."
Yeah. Speaking of Elon Musk, I think he's probably also the most likely person to do geoengineering, right? As he perhaps kind of disintegrates with his kind of coalition with Trump, as that's fallen apart, right? He believes in climate change. Maybe he doesn't talk about it as much anymore as he used to, but he believes he accepts the basic science there. I can see him doing unilateral geoengineering. Is that a path you think about ever?
Yeah, I write about this a little bit in this. There's a political scientist named David Victor who called the idea of the rogue geoengineer. He called him Greenfinger, like the James Bond.
Goldfinger.
Yeah, and the thing is, I also have another friend, a novelist, Neil Stevenson, who wrote a novel describing exactly how that would work. And Termination Shock. It's a lot of fun. And he is dead right in his novel. A billionaire who runs a chain of truck stops in Texas and the Middle West gets a farm in West Texas on the Rio Grande, which their ranch rather, which there are many giant ones. There's a mine on there. There's a lot of old silver mines around, and he builds a big cannon, and it shoots cans of big tubs of sulfur into the ground up sulfur into the upper atmosphere. The sulfur combines with the water vapor in the upper atmosphere and creates H2SO4, which is tiny reflective bubbles of sulfuric acid. This spreads into the stratosphere and bounces off some of the solar light and causes a cool down of the Earth by a degree or two. And then the cans open up parachutes and they float down. And the thing is, somebody could do this. It really, this would not be impossible for a billionaire to do this. And
it's not even impossible. Sorry to interrupt. It's not even impossible for a private company. There is a company called Make Sunsets. I don't know if you come across them, but you can basically get a Netflix style subscription model. You can pay $5 or $25 a month, and they will send up in hydrogen balloons sulfur dioxide, right, which will then be released into the upper atmosphere, and you can essentially sort of pay off your carbon debt, on a subscription model. This is already a thing people can do,
right? And it's, I think it's unlikely to happen right away. But suppose things are on the bad side, as you worry, and as I worry, and that even though we've eliminated RCP 8.5, 4.5 is coming true, and a place like Indonesia is sinking beneath the waves. Indonesia's got a couple hundred billionaires, and I would not be willing to say that one of them wouldn't do this.
A sobering thought. Chelsea Mann, thank you so much for coming along and showing us all your research. There is many, many things we didn't get to on the map, which you can see in the background of this video. And if you've been watching, it is now time for you to do your research and go off and explore these different threads. One way you can do that, of course, is by buying Charles's book, The Wizard and the Prophet, and also reading the articles we talked about in the New Atlantis called How the System Works. Thank you so much, Chelsea Mann.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice to talk to you.